Rome did not fall because its enemies were stronger. Rome fell because it ran out of people, and the clock started ticking 2 centuries before the final collapse. Between 165 and 180 AD, a pandemic swept through the Roman Empire that killed an estimated 5 to 10 million people. Soldiers, farmers, tax collectors, administrators, the exact human machinery that kept one of the most complex systems in the ancient world running. And here is what makes this genuinely alarming rather than just historically sad. The empire never fully recovered the population it lost. Every major crisis that followed happened inside a body that had already been permanently weakened. And most history classes spend more time on the barbarians and the politics than on the pandemic that made both of those problems impossible to manage. In this video, we are going to go through exactly what this plague was, where it came from, what it did to the Roman military and economy, and why the case that it permanently broke the demographic math of Roman expansion is stronger than most people realize. The disease, now known as the Antonine Plague, named after the Antonine dynasty of emperors ruling at the time, entered the Roman world from the east, carried back by soldiers returning from military campaigns in Mesopotamia under the co-emperor Lucius Verus. The troops came home victorious from the Parthian frontier, marched back through the eastern provinces, and brought something with them that no Roman army had ever faced before. The first wave spread through the eastern legions, then reached Rome itself, then moved through the Italian peninsula and across the western provinces, following the roads and trade routes that connected every corner of the empire. The physician Galen, the most important Greek doctor of the Roman world, whose writings dominated medicine for over 1,000 years, was in Rome during the worst of the outbreak, and left the most detailed description we have of what the disease actually did to people. He recorded that it began with fever, often accompanied by shivering and a feeling of deep internal heaviness, followed within days by diarrhea or the coughing up of blood. By the 3rd to 6th day, a black rash appeared on the skin. Galen specifically noted it was foul-smelling in many cases, and over time it thickened into scabs on the hands and feet. As patients recovered, those scabs fell away and left deep pockmarks behind, permanent marks on the skin that Galen described in detail, and that modern scholars have used as the primary basis for identifying the disease. That specific combination of symptoms, the fever, the rash, the scabs, the pockmarks, is consistent with smallpox, and inconsistent with plague, typhus, anthrax, or measles, which are the main alternative candidates historians have proposed. Modern academic consensus, drawing on published epidemiological modeling, has settled on smallpox, specifically variola major, as the most probable pathogen, while acknowledging that certainty is impossible without recovered genetic material. Now, how many people did it actually kill? This is where historical sources and modern estimates diverge significantly, and both sets of numbers matter. Ancient sources, including the Roman historian Cassius Dio, recorded mortality figures suggesting that at the worst points in the city of Rome itself, as many as 2,000 people were dying per day, a number that, if accurate, would represent extraordinary pressure on a city of roughly 1 million inhabitants. Older historians, applying those figures empire-wide and projecting from what we know of ancient population sizes, suggested mortality as high as 25 to 33% of the total population, which would translate to somewhere between 15 and 25 million deaths across the entire empire. Modern academic work, using more conservative epidemiological modeling and archaeological evidence, has pulled that estimate down to roughly 5 to 10 million deaths, approximately 10 to 15% of the empire's population, with significantly higher concentrations in cities and military camps where people lived in close quarters. Even at the conservative end, 5 million deaths in a pre-modern agrarian empire without antibiotics, without germ theory, and without any effective quarantine infrastructure is an almost incomprehensible blow. But the raw death toll is almost secondary to where the deaths were concentrated. And that is the part that changed Rome's trajectory permanently. The legions were hit harder than any other segment of the population, because the conditions of military life, large numbers of men sleeping, eating, and traveling together in tight formation, created exactly the kind of transmission environment where smallpox spreads fastest. Multiple frontier formations along the northern borders of the empire, the British Limes, the Rhine, the Danube, were degraded so severely that the army had to physically withdraw from outlying positions it had previously held. Roman expansion, which had been the economic engine of the empire for centuries, bringing in slaves, tribute, agricultural land, and tax revenue from conquered territories, effectively halted during and after the reign of Marcus Aurelius and never resumed its previous scale. Marcus Aurelius himself, one of the most capable emperors Rome ever produced, was forced to recruit heavily from Germanic slaves and barbarian auxiliaries to fill the gaps left in the legions by plague casualties. That was not a small administrative adjustment. It was a structural transformation of what the Roman army fundamentally was. The ethnic Roman character of the core legions, the cultural and political glue that had held the military together as an institution, began to dilute at exactly the moment when frontier pressure from Germanic tribes was intensifying, creating a compounding vulnerability that would take decades to fully surface. Lucius Verus, the co-emperor who had commanded the Parthian campaigns that brought the plague back, died around 169 AD, widely reported in ancient sources as a victim of the disease he had unknowingly imported. The Marcomannic Wars that Marcus Aurelius was simultaneously fighting along the Danube, one of the most serious frontier crises Rome had faced in generations, were severely disrupted by plague casualties and could only be sustained through emergency recruitment of populations that would previously never have been considered eligible for Roman military service. At one point, Marcus Aurelius held a public sale of imperial household goods on the palace grounds: gold cups, jewelry, fine textiles, specifically to raise money for frontier pay during the simultaneous crisis of plague casualties and active warfare. That image alone, the emperor selling his own dinnerware to fund the army, captures the fiscal reality better than any economic statistic, because alongside the military losses, the plague was destroying the economic base that funded everything. The working-age population was hit most heavily. The farmers who grew the food, the craftsmen who built the tools, the traders who moved goods along the roads, and the tax collectors who extracted revenue from all of them. With fewer people doing all of those things simultaneously, the imperial economic engine slowed, and to compensate, the Roman government did what governments under fiscal pressure have always done. It debased the currency. The denarius, Rome's standard silver coin, had its silver content progressively reduced through the reigns of Marcus Aurelius and his successor Commodus, as the government tried to cover rising military costs with a shrinking tax base. Severely debased silver coins from this exact period remain one of the most common categories of archaeological evidence for the Antonine era, physical proof of the fiscal stress visible in the ground. The disease also produced a cultural consequence that historians have increasingly recognized as one of the most significant long-term effects of the entire outbreak. Traditional Roman religion had no theological framework that could explain a plague of this scale. The Roman civic gods were gods of order and victory, not gods of suffering and consolation. The Antonine Plague is widely identified by historians of religion as a major driver of the wave of religious conversion that swept the empire in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, toward Christianity, toward Mithraism, and toward several other alternative religious movements. Christian communities specifically organized care of the sick, refused to abandon plague victims, and continued visiting the ill when others fled, a behavioral difference from the impersonal civic religious system that produced a measurable recruitment advantage in the decades that followed. The disease did not end in 180 AD, when Marcus Aurelius died. Recurrence waves are documented through the 180s and into the 190s, and recent demographic modeling suggests the empire may never have recovered its pre-plague population before the 3rd century crisis. A period of almost simultaneous military invasions, economic collapse, and political chaos that nearly tore the empire apart entirely. The argument that the Antonine Plague permanently broke the demographic math of Roman expansion is contested. Some historians emphasize military and political causes over epidemiological ones. But what is not contested is that every major structural problem Rome faced in the century after 180 AD was being managed with fewer soldiers, fewer farmers, less tax revenue, and less institutional capacity than existed before 165 AD. Older historical surveys soft-pedaled the Antonine Plague partly because of uncertainty about the pathogen, and partly because traditional Roman decline narratives were built around political and economic mechanisms. The traditional story of Rome falling because of bad emperors and barbarian invasions fits neatly into a narrative. A pandemic is messier and harder to dramatize. Modern scholarship, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic of the early 2020, forced historians to reconsider how severely sustained outbreaks can restructure pre-modern societies, has refocused significant attention on this period, and several major edited volumes on Roman epidemiology published in the past few years draw the contemporary parallel explicitly. The most uncomfortable takeaway is also the most important one. A society can lose a war it never knew it was fighting, against an enemy that leaves no monuments, no battle records, and no peace treaties, just empty farms, depleted legions, and a government selling the emperor's gold cups to keep the lights on. If this made you rethink what actually drives the collapse of complex systems, the next video I'd point you toward covers another civilization that fell for a reason almost nobody talks about, and the evidence for it was buried underground for centuries before anyone thought to look.